So welcome, an official welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you for coming early enough to get seats in this room. So that's really great. But this is Sam's second trip here. And I think some of you probably had the wonderful opportunity to hear him talk about the Amazonia exhibition as well. So, how many of you have been upstairs to see National Geographic? Ah, okay, so most of you still have that ahead. It's a beautiful show. And Sam has two works in that exhibition and then also a work from the Amazonia show that's in the Schnitzer Gallery. So you may remember that when you walk through that one. But we're delighted to bring National Geographic Greatest Photographs of the American West. It's kind of a continuation of our Linda Lanker show and our interest in the environment, and I know that it touches many of your hearts. It's also absolutely wonderful to bring Sam Abel back here. As many of you know, he is one of the best photographers in the world, if I might say that. He's also an amazing teacher. And to me, every time he opens his mouth, almost, it's enlightening. There's some great story or some new way of looking at things or something that will make you a little bit more alert and more aware of what you're looking at. So that's a real treat. Sam has, since 1970, worked with National Geographic and has photographed more than 20 articles in various cultural and wilderness subjects all over the world. He has lectured, as I said, on photography, teaches workshops, and exhibits his images, again, all over the United States and abroad. Sam has many book credits, and I'm not going to list them all, but they include Australia, Journey Through a Timeless Land, and Seeing Gardens. In 1998, he collaborated with author Stephen Ambrose on Lewis and Clark, Voyage of Discovery, and again in 2002 on the Mississippi River of History. That same year, he worked with Leah Ben David Gall to produce a retrospective of his life and work titled Sam Abel, The Photographic Life. And I was really fortunate to be able to work with both of them on that at the University of Virginia. Among his more recent projects, as you know, is Amazonia, a project that he did with Torben Nielsen that we presented in 2010 with an accompanying book, and The Life of a Photograph. And again, that's just skimming the many publications that he does have. He is currently working on a multi-volume Sam Abel library, which is truly wonderful, so we're all looking forward to that. And I would also like to give a shout out to Canon USA's Explorer of Light program, which is sponsoring Sam's visit and this talk. So again, thank you for coming. Please welcome Sam Abel.
I want to thank Jill very much for her loyalty to me. I'm not one of those people who's loyal to institutions, but I'm loyal to people, and I belong to that sizable group of people in Charlottesville, Virginia, who thought that Jill and her husband, Richard Hertzkovitz, were national living treasures. And those people in Charlottesville that didn't know that when she was there knew it after she came here. So you have someone special here and a very, very special museum. I also want to pay tribute to Canon USA, Explorers of Light program. I've worked with them and they have supported my photography for 20 years. I think their cameras speak for themselves, but I just want to say it's a special culture at Canon that puts photographers like me in rooms like this, in front of audiences like you, all over the United States, in the name of education and photographic appreciation. I also want to say something about the University of Oregon and its campus and this museum. First of all, the museum is a teaching institution, and that lines up so well with my life and my interest in photography. My interest in photography is in how it continues our education about life, about culture, about issues that are important to us, about our families, our travels. Photography has been an intimate, ongoing, deep force in my life, and I like sharing that. In connection with that, I want to blend that together with a thought about this campus, which has, well, I just want to say I've been on many, many college campuses. None of them have the great trees of this campus. The Pioneer Cemetery, I want to just take with me back to Virginia and have with me wherever I'm living. Walking over to the campus, walking through that cemetery today under those enormous trees, I thought this is a great college campus with great, great trees. And one of them, just a few hundred feet away from here, is a Buckeye tree. And I'm from the Buckeye State. So I took 20 minutes to find the perfect Buckeye, and I'm going to give it to this lady right here, who is from my hometown in Sylvania, Ohio.
Thank you.
A little bit more about Sylvania later, but yesterday I spoke to the docents of this museum, and I talked to them about the great influence on my life of, that the docents were at the Toledo Museum of Art. For 3 years, every Saturday, my mother packed my brother and I off to the museum to get us out of the house, I now realize. We went to the museum, and I was too young to take a class. And so for 3 years, I, together with a small gaggle of children my age, walked around the museum and sat beneath the great paintings in that museum and listened to docents tell us why, not only why they were great, but how they worked and why they were important. That so strongly influenced my life. And Debbie Broker said to me just up here a few moments ago that not only was she a docent here at this museum, she had been a docent at the Toledo Museum of Art. So thank you so much. And to all the docents, I want to say thank you. You have an influence that you do not know about. What I'm going to do today is what I like to do best, and it's what docents do and did for me, and that is deconstruct, break down, and analyze photographs for how they work. So I hope it's entertaining, but I hope it's also educational. And I hope that it touches that spot in you that you would call art. Photography has done that for, with, and in my life since I was a little boy. So let's begin. These are my parents when they were secretly married. My dad was from central Kentucky, my mother from northern Ohio. They met in southern Ohio, where it was not permissible for a married couple to both hold down jobs in the same school system. And so while escorting the senior class trip to Washington, D.C., they grabbed a cab, went across the Potomac River, got married in the Alexandria, Virginia courthouse, shot back across the river and picked up with that senior class and carried on and kept their marriage secret for 2 years. When I was married, I also eloped to the Alexandria, Virginia courthouse, and I kept its secret for 20 minutes. I want to draw your attention to one line. It's the horizon line. It's Lake Erie, but it could be Northwest Ohio, where I grew up and where I saw the landscape for the first time, and deeply so for the first 18 years of my life. I mention it because it's the most powerful compositional element in all of my photographs. Apparently, when I bring the camera to my eye, that horizon line, in some form or another, has to be present for me to compose a deep photograph. I compose my photographs from the back to the front, And I think that my grandfather did that in this photograph. This is an emblem of my father, his sentiments, and his beautiful handwriting. It was a letter he wrote to his mother, to his wife, my mother, when they were secretly married. The date is September the 7th, 1938, and the message is, "Dearest Precious, on May 7th, 1938, I loved you as if you were the only girl in the world. And today, 4 months later, I loved you 4 times as much as I did then." I always show this letter when I'm on a college campus because handwriting like this, even in love letters, is not done. And it's a reminder to college students, if any are in this room, write your own love letters. My introduction to the photographic life was as a model in the Abel family Christmas cards. My brother was 3 years older than I, born in 1942, I in 1945. And my brother said recently, this is today his earliest memory of me, this moment, this picture. Despite the fact that my brother and I were 3 years apart in age, my mother persisted for 10 years in dressing us as twins. I'm now preparing a private book for my brother for his birthday in May that has all of the photographs of us as twins taken by our father. The title of the book is When We Were Twins. I know there's a football game here at the University of Oregon. And by the way, the University of Oregon football team paid a visit to my town where I've lived for 33 years, Charlottesville, Virginia. I just like to point out we scored the first touchdown. Virginia, Oregon, I know, Ducks versus Huskies, that's big. But there's a few people in the room that know that the most intense rivalry in America, in sports, any sport, all sports, is between the Ohio State Buckeyes and the University of Michigan Wolverines. And our family home was in Ohio on the Michigan line. And that line, that boundary, needed to be guarded. That's our house, and in the basement of that house was my dad's dark room. It was in a fruit cellar, and it was the kind of handmade, homemade basement dark room that was only dark at night. And it's there that I learned photography, helping my father, who was a high school teacher who took wedding pictures on the weekend and ran the school camera club. So the Christmas cards with my brother and I as twins had a couple of fantasies embedded in them every year. This is our fantasy that we're going to play for Ohio State. And here's my mother's fantasy. That we were good boys. My brother was a good boy. I less so. Here we are, and this is the cover picture for the book, When We Were Twins. I feel sure that my mother made those suits. She made a lot of our clothes, often monogrammed. She made one other thing. She made it when she was pregnant with my brother in 1942. It's a map of the United States, each state containing an emblem of its most significant feature. It looks like Oregon's is, well, some kind of fruit. Pears, I think. Maybe Harry and David pears, possibly. That's a little bit better than Ohio, a belching, carbon-spewing steel mill. More importantly, this map signified her deepest wish, that together we as a family would travel together, we four, her yet-to-be-born boys, her husband, herself, that we would travel together on long car trips throughout the United States, and that eventually we would touch all of those states. And we did. And the purpose of those trips was not to camp or fish or hike, climb mountains, swim, boat, or any of those things. The purpose of it was education. To go to the national parks and learn about them, to go to the national historical parks and learn about them. Here we are on such an educational trip, my brother and I. You didn't dress like that on your family vacations? 50 years later, I did a book on the Mississippi River, and I was out on a paddle wheel steamboat with Stephen Ambrose, the legendary writer and esteemed historian. And I said, Steve, look at this picture, and I handed him this photograph. I said, there's my brother and I 50 years ago standing on a banana boat, holding the bananas, and we met the stevedores, and that was how we learned about imports and exports. And he said, well, that's interesting, Sam, but what are you guys wearing? Embedded in this photograph is something about photography, something that my dad taught me and something that's here, and that is layering. There's the landscape layer at the back, and then the water layer in the middle, and then the foreground layer, which is the two men, my brother and I. But there's something else. He composed the picture and waited for the moment. The moment is the man on the right having a drink of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. That is the primary lesson that my father taught me. Gently, very soft-spokenly, he would whisper in my ears, Sammy, compose the picture and wait. Wait for something to happen. We had one great photographic book in our family library. It was The Family of Man. I wore it out. The book has been broken and badly glued back together again by me. The book contains a humanistic view of photography that my father's own photographs lived up to. None more so than this beautiful, humble, straightforward photograph of my brother standing in front of our grandfather's car in Paynesville, Ohio, about to go fishing. The year is 1954. My brother's wearing a Cleveland Indians t-shirt and hat. This year, the Indians won more games in a season than any team ever has. 111 victories out of 154 games played. My brother went to the World Series that year and saw the Indians swept by the Giants. It broke his heart, and mine too. And so I made him a promise that I would show this photograph in every slideshow I give until the Cleveland Indians win the World Series. There's a message on my phone, it came through about 10 minutes ago, from my brother telling me about the Indians game tonight. They're going to clinch wild card. It's the beginning of a trajectory. This might be the last audience that ever sees this picture. My father and I were great friends at home, in our travels, and in photography. We're outside the darkroom at Sylvania High School, where he had a darkroom and ran the camera club. When I was 15, two significant things happened. Number one, I attended a lecture just like this, given by a National Geographic photographer named Albert Moldvay at Kent State University. I stood in the back, the equivalent of the overflow room. I can't remember his photographs. I can't remember what he said. I just remember that he was real. And from that time forward, I've had a great faith in live events, exactly like this one that we're all at right now. Live because if I had seen Albert Moldvay on TV, it wouldn't have changed my life. But something that day did change my life. It was his reality. I think I formed the idea then that he was no different than my dad and that I could grow up to be like him in some way. 7 years later, when I was 22, I was a photographer and a photographic intern at National Geographic. It wouldn't have happened had I seen him on television. The other significant thing that happened was I made this photograph. It's a photograph of my father watching a train depart from the station in Paynesville, Ohio. I'm using my dad's camera. He, as I said, spoke to me gently about photography. He had taken a class from a photographer at the Toledo Blade, our local newspaper, the paper I delivered. I knew this photographer's work, and my dad would eagerly tell me after class what he had learned. Many of the things that he told me are in this photograph. Sammy, take a low angle. Low angle, more impact. Look for strong graphics. Look for the S-curve or powerful diagonals. Keep the sun to your back. Remember, bad weather makes good pictures. And above all, compose the picture and wait. Something he didn't talk about, but which I brought to photography primarily, I guess, because of my mother's aesthetics, is this: micro-composition. When I look at this picture, I don't look at the train or the icicles. I don't think about the weather. I only look at this, that little space. It separates my father from this building and allows that line to be almost complete, almost an S-curve, elegant and influence-giving to the mood of this photograph, as strong in its power as his hat and his gesture. And that's another thing he taught me. Sammy, in a photograph, there are three things to consider: the setting, the expression, and the gesture. It's micro-composition that separates those things. And the difference between a fine photograph and a good photograph, and an indifferent photograph, is attention to details. I say this to the students who take my workshops: if you want to make fine photographs, make fine snapshots. As I said, at the age of 22, after attending the University of Kentucky and being editor of the yearbook there, I was a summer intern at National Geographic. This is the photography staff in 1967. On the far right is Albert Moldvay, the man I heard speak at Kent State. And this man I want to pay special tribute to, the legendary director of photography at Geographic, Robert Gilka. He died this year at the age of 95. We were great friends in retirement. He interviewed me for the summer internship job that I got. It was the only job interview I ever had. I asked him years later why he had hired me, and he bit off the answer: potential. He wasn't wrong about that. National Geographic was the right life for me because of my parents. My first assignment was to southern Arizona, near the Mexico border. I took a photograph of a double rainbow over a dig. I sent that photograph and all of them away to Geographic. A week later came this telegram. It says, "Good sharpshooting on shipment 1 and 2. A tip of the hat, Moldvay." The crucial thing, though, is right here. carbon copy, Robert E. Gilka. And Gilka came down to Moldvay's office and said, show me some of Abel's work. And he showed him the double rainbow in the storm over the dig site. Gilka's thought about National Geographic photography and photographers was that the photographers had to make images when none were apparent. If an intern could make interesting photographs on a dead archaeological dig, then maybe that photographer really did have potential. Here is that photograph. I would say that the photograph I made of my dad is the foundation photograph for my life. But I would say that this photograph, this dig, this double rainbow, is the foundation photograph for my career at National Geographic. Because of it, I got another assignment, and it was much more consequential, to go around the world with the U.S. Coast Guard. The last voyage of world significance, yet unaccomplished. We made it halfway. We were stopped by the ice, as you can see in this picture. It was pre-global warming. There was a lot of ice in the Arctic, too much for us to bash our way through. We tried another route closer to Siberia and were stopped by the Russians and eventually ordered by our State Department to return to Rotterdam. The trip almost killed me. My neck was paralyzed and I should have lost my left hand. I told no one about it. I'd learned that as editor of the high school yearbook. The day before I saw the yearbook, my yearbook advisor drew me aside and said, Sam, tomorrow you're going to see the yearbook, which I had been editor for and photographer for and designer of. He said, you will only see the few mistakes. Two things. Learn from those mistakes. And secondly, don't point them out to others. So I told no one at National Geographic about my paralyzed neck, the near loss of my left hand, the profound seasickness that I and the others were under for 6 days as we stood still in the North Sea during a monumental gale. I thought to myself, this is a test, and to live this life, to be a National Geographic photographer, surely that means taking tests. I knew that I didn't have to ace them, but I knew I couldn't fail. Speaking of that, I hadn't graduated from college. I had devoted my life to photography, to editing the UK yearbook, and to National Geographic, and generally to photography. My class graduated in '69. Here I am, July the 13th, my class graduated in '67, and here I am, July 13th, 1969. My dad goes into our basement just outside the fruit cellar darkroom, sits down at his typewriter, and composes a letter to me with his 8-point plan on how to graduate from college. Look alert, parenthesis, don't sleep in class. Lean forward from the hip line toward the professor. Show more than average interest at all times. Scout the teacher. Find out what it is he wants and let him have it. Scout the opposition, other students. Be more dynamic than they. Consider the course a challenge. Cope with the challenge. Most profs will not fail a student who, in their opinion, really tried to pass the course. And his last point, come hell or high water, pass. And then he signs it with his nickname, my nickname for him. I called him Daddy Boy, always. And he signed it Daddy Boy, let me know that it was an affectionate, stern but affectionate letter. And then he has 3 more thoughts. Notes or pretend to be taking notes. Ask professor to sit closer. And finally, give him a bottle of liquor as a going away gift. When I teach a workshop, I always show this the day before the class is about to be over. We had one other thing in our house that I want to draw your attention to, and that is stereo photographs, meant to be seen in a stereo viewer, which gave to photography a three-dimensional power and beauty and mesmerizing quality. I have long wanted my photographs to have that three-dimensional quality, even though they cannot. And I will show you a couple that do have it. And one is in this exhibition upstairs, and one is in the slideshow. Both were published in the Geographic. But I just want to say that this is not only photography's past. 3D imagery is photography's future. It's right around the corner. And when photography regains 3D, it will regain the incomparable power that stereo cards had for me as a little boy. The cards were about faraway places. Those are the places that I wanted to see and photograph. I'm on the southwest coast of Japan, in a small city named Hagi. I'm being obedient to what my father taught me. Compose the picture, seek the setting, and wait. I went to the street corner every day that I could for 5 weeks. Why did I do that? It was the best street corner in this city of many street corners, many walls. It had the best light morning and evening, and it had the best walls. So why go anywhere else? It's a lesson that I would give you about travel. Go to one place, not every place. For a moment, I followed these women, photographing them with the 28mm lens, my lens of choice. And then out of politeness, I stepped back and made the photograph that was published of one of the women caressing the garments of her younger friend as they say goodbye. Setting, expression, gesture. In this photograph, even though the mass or the volume of them is very different, even though the setting dominates the picture, I feel that the eloquence of the lady's expression and the tenderness of their gesture makes the picture strangely balanced between setting, expression, and gesture. The year is 1983. It's 5 a.m. in Moscow. It's a day off. It's a Sunday. But I think anyone who worked at National Geographic, anyone who loves photography, knows truthfully there are no days off. But I awoke this day and walked over to the window. In front of me was a curtain, and just behind it, the double windows of traditional Russian architecture. Between the windows, pears that my wife had bought on the black market. Beyond that, the wet pavement of a vast parking lot. Rising from it, the Kremlin. Framing in the deep distance, St. Basil's Cathedral. Above that, and on the final layer, clouds. I made this photograph, took a Polaroid, looked at the Polaroid, and decided I would devote this day off to photographing this scene. The first thing I did was remove the curtain. It made the middle layer, the pavement, more powerful. Buses arrived. I waited and composed the little line of people walking across the now drying pavement. I got the dubious idea of turning this very horizontal scene into a vertical, but I composed the spire of the Kremlin into the folds of the curtain and waited for a pedestrian to complete the composition. More buses arrived. And then I got the phenomenally bad idea of replacing the Kremlin and the cathedral and the sky with pavement, trucks, and cars parked and in motion. But into this composition comes the key to the finished photograph which is maybe an hour out ahead of me. And it's not an inconsequential moment. The photograph that's going to be made in an hour, that this picture is the key to, was later named last year one of the 50 greatest photographs ever made at National Geographic. And what is that compositional key? It's the horizon line, the edge of the concrete windowsill. In fact, these are all horizon lines. There are probably a dozen of them in here. And that's what I'm responding to, because that's the innermost aesthetic that I have as a photographer and as a person. And that is someone who seeks the horizon line to anchor and deepen and make whole the photograph. So yes, this is a failure, but in it is the key to the ultimate success of the image. And then I get a second terrible idea, which is shrink the Kremlin and make the pears Magritte-like, or as someone said, like pear-shaped boulders. But there is that horizon line. There it is. It's blocking the pavement, the buses, the trucks, the cars, and the people. Now I'm quite close to the final photograph. When I make a photograph like this, when I make any photograph, I try to still down as many of the elements as I can. That's what my dad meant when he said compose. That implied focus, nailing the focus down, nailing the exposure, as well as nailing the composition. I say to myself in each composition, what's in motion and what's not. And the only layer in motion here is the cloud layer. And so I'm composing the clouds. There's something missing though. The picture is a little inanimate. I replace the curtain. And now there are two layers in motion, the deep layer of the clouds and the very, very close layer of the curtain. My camera's on a tripod. I'm not looking at the pears, the Kremlin, St. Basil's Cathedral. I'm not looking at the window or the window frame. I'm only looking at the curtain, and I'm only looking at a certain part of it. I'm only looking at the bottom of it, which has a satin fringe or stripe of fabric. I notice that as the breeze enters the room, it lifts the curtain into the composition. And I want to make the photograph when the ribbon is at its most graceful, to give to the bottom of the photograph the life that the pears, the Kremlin, the cathedral, and the clouds give to the rest of the photograph. This is the photograph judged by National Geographic to be one of the 50 greatest ever made there. Not my decision. It happened after I had retired. I'll just point out it was made on a day off. I show this for one other important reason. I believe that photographs are not a result of luck, expensive equipment, access, or special circumstances. Fine photographs are the result of a thoughtful process. They're the result of applying your thoughts to the photographic situation in front of you. Part of that process necessarily is mistakes, but the mistakes should also be thoughtful. I said that I retired from the National Geographic. Did that mean that I was no longer a photographer? That I could no longer take photographs like pears on the windowsill? Well, here's an example of a photograph I made 2 years ago. It's my wife's Christmas present from me, the acclaimed most difficult jigsaw puzzle ever created. The 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of Jackson Pollock's drip painting, Confluence number 10 from the Buffalo, New York Art Museum. This is the photograph I made on the first day, but I photographed it for 4 days. Here's the finished photograph. Windows play a role in my photography. The pears, the puzzle, and now this train in Thunder Bay, Ontario. It shows 6 women, and their expressions are very subtle. But the artist whose work is on my mind as I take this is my favorite artist, Edward Hopper. And I know that Hopper liked to look into windows. There's a slight voyeuristic quality to a lot of his influential imagery. And I'm just thinking, are these expressions enough? One woman is smoking, 2 women drinking a cup of tea, another pair of women in thoughtful conversation. And I want this to rise up and be a photograph when out of the corner of my eye, at the next window, I see a waiter in a white jacket spreading a starch white cotton tablecloth on an open window, the table behind an open window. I have composed the picture and I'm waiting. It was just a very small move to swing the camera leftward and pick up his gesture. I'm in Oberlin, Ohio to write the commencement address I gave for the University of Toledo, my hometown university. Naturally, I'm not writing. I'm sitting and looking out the window, and I'm thinking about our house just west of Toledo and the windows in it and my mother's fine things that she displayed on the windowsills of our house. The woman who ran this bed and breakfast in Oberlin entered the room, saw me making this picture, and said, "Oh, Mr. Abel, wouldn't you like the lights on?" And I said, I looked at her, I thought for a moment, and I thought no, and I said yes, because my mother had taught me, among many, many things, to lie constructively. She turned on the light, and as a courtesy to her, I made one more photograph. And as I did so, a dog raced into the picture and caught a Frisbee. Compose the picture, Sammy, and wait. Wait for what? I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm with a group of photographers, small group, 4 photographers, who have badgered me into talking about how you make layered photographs. That's an aspiration of photographers, and it's difficult to achieve. But I have a way of at least talking about it. And I say you begin with the back layer. And in case nothing happens, you'll always have the back layer. So let's go out into Charleston and see if we can find a setting that we like and call that the back layer. Well, I like this setting. I like the calligraphy. I like the antiquity. I love all the horizon lines. And I just like the signage. And I said, all right, you take this picture and you wait. And a moment later, pulling up and stopping at a red light was a pickup truck. And I said, see, there. You micro-compose the driver's head so that it reads, even though it's small, you can see that it's a head. Picture over. And then a woman talking on a cell phone pulled up and gave the picture a 3rd layer. I did one thing in the 2 seconds while she was there. I stood on my tiptoes to preserve this horizon line. It's micro-composition. It separates those 2 cars just a little bit more. It's a tiny thing. Now, it's possible you could walk up to this intersection and take this picture. Just walk up and take it. But you would be a better photographer than I am. My pictures have to be built. and I build them from the back to the front. No one who sees this picture will know that I carefully put into the photograph a roof line, that I stood on my toes to preserve the line of the bed of the blue pickup truck. What they will see is a photograph that looks inevitable, which is my goal, to make my photographs look unforced and inevitable. But you know now that this photograph is the result of a process, just like the pears on the windowsill. Here's a scene in Venice Beach. Is a Muslim girl working out on the parallel bars. There's a problem in this photograph. The problem is this lifeguard stand. I'm trying to bury it behind those posts. I'm making it worse by doing that. It's very clunky. But I get down lower and I move to my right. And a moment later, I take the finished photograph. This photograph, made this summer by me on the coast of Maine while I was teaching a workshop with students, excited me. I loved the light. It was like being in a studio. And the gulls were fantastic. They provided a tremendous drama to the picture, action, energy, and graphical power. And the guy was great. He was wrestling this chute of fish into containers. His expression, his gesture, everything. But the picture was a little clunky behind him, and I thought it could be more complex. I stayed with it. This is the result. Also on the coast of Maine, on Monhegan Island. I took my workshop class out there, and I said, class, come alive when we dock this boat. Jump out of the boat, things are going to happen, ropes are going to be thrown, people are going to be shouting and gesturing, there's going to be energy after an hour of passivity. There's going to be energy. And remember, background first. I showed this to my friend Arthur Meyerson. He took a later ferry with his class. And I showed this picture to him on the back of my camera. And I said, Arthur, I got a good picture when the boat landed. He said, did you? Let me see it. And he looked at it, and he recognized it as a good picture, which bummed him out. I said, did you see the boat in the upper left-hand corner? Got that in. Yes, Sam, I saw the damn boat. A question arises, perhaps, in your mind. How long in this compose and wait idea of photography will you wait? And the answer is just a moment in the case of the rope throw, but quite a bit longer in other situations. This is Tolstoy's grave in the winter. This is 6 months later. My camera's on a tripod. The composition, focus, and exposure are all locked in. I'm not even looking through the viewfinder. I know what the composition is. I'm courteously photographing with a cable release because around Tolstoy's grave was respected by the Russians a zone of silence. I never heard a word spoken, not even when this bridal party came from a church and the bride placed her wedding bouquet on Tolstoy's grave. I made this picture in Alberta, Canada, on the Blood Indian Reserve. I had looked for a year to find skulls on the open prairie because I wanted the picture to conclude the Charlie Russell story. Russell's paintings always featured skulls of bison on the open range. They're scattered around in his paintings his whole career. They were part of his signature. I had to find bison skulls. These skulls were put here by Canadian Indians to decay so that they could use them in their ceremonies and paint them. When I found this, after looking for a year, I thought that I'd made a picture. I had not. But almost all of the photography you're seeing occurred in the film era. The entire span of my career at the Geographic was with film. Just a gentle reminder, you never saw your work. I didn't know how bland this was until I got back to the Geographic. I was happy when I was standing here and unhappy when I looked at the film. I said to myself, I've got to go back. And this was the golden age of photography at the Geographic, where for the first 20 years of my career there, I never heard the word budget, not for time, money, or equipment. And so I went back 6 months later just to see what this looked like in the snow. I composed the picture as a still life, and into the composition walked a bull bison. He paused for a moment in exactly the right place. Compose the picture, Sammy, and wait. What drew me from the sidewalk in Cleveland, Ohio, into this restaurant was the improbable, supersized copy of Rousseau's famous painting and weirdly, the Christmas tree lights up above. And I thought, this is a still life that has a life. And then one of the waitresses, the one who's sitting down, said, do you mind if I sit here? This is where I sit before my shift. I said, no, I had my picture. And now she was presenting me with another possibility. And so I composed her into the corner of the frame with her face in front of the foliage. Picture over. And then a coworker came, disregarded me, because she was on a rant against management. So here it is, setting, expression, and gesture. A complete Sam Abell photograph. Case closed for 10 years. And then 2 years ago, I was in New York City to see the de Kooning show at the Museum of Modern Art. I took it in and I began to wander. And I encountered, coming around the corner, the original painting. A woman was reading the wall copy. I waited. I wanted there to be a gesture. I knew there wouldn't be, but I've been rewarded enough in my life for waiting to keep waiting. Improbably, illegally, after she read the wall copy, out of some kind of reverence and respect, she touched the painting. 10 years had passed. Still, I'm capable of waiting longer. This is the goddaughter of my wife and me. Her name is Azura Lockwood. This is the day we met at a costume party in her honor in Seattle. She grew tired during the party. Her costume slipped a little bit, and she was put on this couch. I passed through the room. And because I commonly have a camera with me, I stopped and photographed her. Most people see fabric, they see the child asleep. I based the composition on something that you wouldn't see ordinarily. I fixed the composition on the horizon line between the back and the seat of the couch. 14 years passed. Azura and her mother were living in Portland. I paid a visit and made a photograph of her. Another 14 years have now passed, and I feel the urge to find Azura and photograph her again. Let these two photographs be a reminder that all photographs, all of them, are about time. So you get the idea. Compose and wait. I fixed this composition on the line that separates the soil from the pavement. It included the tree and the puddle in the upper right-hand corner. I composed on a scene that had no people. I waited for the schoolgirls to pass beneath. Waited in Tokyo for the dignitaries, the ambassadors, the special guests to arrive in the rain for the emperor's spring garden party. I was photographing the man who owned this cattle station in Australia. His ranch was burning up. He was eventually to lose it because of this brush fire. It was powerfully on his mind what to do about it, the consequences, what it would mean. I composed him in reference to the shape between the back of his head and the curve of the bedstead. That was my photograph. And into it wandered his granddaughter, who was in another state of being entirely. She was in dream time, and she ran her foot up to that shield with the horns on it. And when her toe touched the shield, I made a photograph. But there was a strain to it, a forced quality. And when her foot came off that, I made another photograph that properly catches her in dream time, and he in the opposite. I stood backstage at the Fenice Opera in Venice, Italy, and waited for the opera to end so that I could photograph the soprano taking a bow. Only a fragment of her face is visible, but that is enough for me. Setting, expression, and above all in this photograph, gesture. For a book on canoeing in America, I made this picture in Okefenokee Swamp, which has the world's most reflective water. What I'm going to talk about here for the first time is micro-composition. The canoe is moving forward. You can see the water sweeping away from each side of it at the bottom or base of the photograph. I'm paddling it, and then I stand up, and the canoe on its own makes its way into the composition, and I micro-compose the prow into the cloud before it reaches the inverted trees. It's a picture that always has reminded me of canoeing through a forest. Does compose and wait work with animals? I waited 20 minutes for these horses, these wild stallions in the west of England, to raise their heads. They did not. And then after 20 minutes of steadily looking at them with their heads down, I heard, and they heard, on a far-off moor, another stallion whinny. Look at their ears and the angle of their heads. It was instant, immediate, and identical. And here's one of my favorite photographs. The lead photograph for the National Geographic story on hedgerows. I'll just point out that I was a little bit fearful and very apprehensive about what was around that corner we were speeding. And as the dog looked back at me, I made this photograph because I thought the expression on the dog's face caught my innermost feelings perfectly. This photograph, that is the right-hand side of it, became the cover for National Geographic, my second cover. I had 3 covers in 30 years, and I have a good thing to say about them, and that is they were all photographs. They weren't made as cover pictures. They were taken from life, as all of my pictures are. I came upon these 4 and asked them if they would pose for a picture. And they stared blankly at me, and the picture was going nowhere. And then off camera, far off camera, like the stallion whinnying, there was a honk of a car horn and a shout out to these 3. And they all looked off to their right, my left. And as they did so, a blast of wind hit the horse and blew its mane backwards. It gave it life. And that is what I'm after in a photograph. the elusive quality of life. What gives it, what takes it, and how to get it. Wind again gave me a photograph on this island in one of the lakes in northern Italy. There were 4 courting and parading albino peacocks, and you cannot go wrong with that situation. It's impossible to make a bad photograph. I had the island to myself, I had a pocket full of film, and the light, because it was June, was lingering. If you photograph steadily every day for a year, one day everything will go right. And that was this day. Nevertheless, I waited, and my wait was rewarded by having a blast of wind hit the peacocks and blow their displayed feathers back over their heads. A photograph taken in Venice, Louisiana, of a hawk or an osprey coming into its nest. It wasn't a hard picture to take. I composed and waited. I did the same thing here in Alaska, but the episode was much more personal. I'd lost all of my cameras but one, all of my lenses but one, on a capsizing on the trip of a lifetime, a 3-week trip on a canoe, in a canoe, on a very wild northern river above the Arctic Circle. A trip I knew I would never take again. After my film was lost, I took my cameras, I took long walks to console myself. And on one of these walks, I surprised and was surprised by an owl. Perhaps it had never seen a person before. It flew around my head in a space much, much smaller than this room, just around me here, maybe 15 feet away from my head. It went around and around and around. I had a Leica rangefinder camera around my neck. I didn't move. I took it in as a human experience, not a photographic one. Just absorb this, Sam. The silence of this owl, the mystery that it can turn its head back while flying forward. You can't hear it. It's so close. I took it in, and the owl flew away to a bush. It's this bush here, the highest bush in the vicinity of the two of us. And it sat and looked at me. And then it began to fly. And it didn't fly over my head, it flew at my head. I had carefully raised the Leica up to my eyes. I had composed the picture, and I was waiting. When, abruptly, it turned over my head, upward, and looked down, I made the picture. It's not a professional wildlife photograph. It's not even worthy of being published in National Geographic. What this is a personal photograph. I have long believed in the power of personal photography, and I kept a black and white and then a color photographic journal all my life, to not lose track of my personal life. So this is a personal moment, an emblem of an encounter and an experience that made my life richer. And I have a rough, irregular, impressionistic image of it, and it's one of my favorite photographs. I look at settings for their potential. Here I'm doing something destructive. I'm in Japan at a farmer's market. There's a large aquarium of fish that are for sale. A man is looking at them from the other side of the aquarium. The destructive thing I'm doing is making a horizon in a vertical format photograph of the top of the aquarium, but it is a graceless, clunky composition of the sky, the tree, the pavement, the aquarium, and the man. The man moved off. I settled down. The thing to watch is the tree. A snake was captured by my cousin on our canoe book on the Missouri River in Montana. He gathered it onto his paddle, and my first instinct was to make a still life linked to a landscape, like the pears are linked to the Kremlin, and the skulls of the dead bison are linked to the landscape with the live bison. A still life in the foreground, a landscape in the background. But the snake moved, and I settled on a still life. There are 3 elements, or 4, or 5, in this picture. The story is that there's a wild dolphin that lives off the coast of Ireland and has a relationship with this dog. The dog belonged to the owner of the inn that I was staying in. My experience with dolphins is you cannot photograph them. If you see them, the picture's over. You can't react fast enough. And since I don't use a motor drive, I was up against a challenge. This is like sports photography. All of the elements are here, but they don't unite. There's the landscape, the water, the dolphin, the boat, and the dog. It's a decent picture, but not enough. It's not composed. And so I composed the picture without the dolphin, and I waited. Can I take credit for the way that the dolphin's back mimics the landscape? Can I take credit for the framing of the dolphin's face between those ropes? I can't, but I will. Sometimes I don't do the waiting. I waited for this picture. I missed the sunset and sat in a state of deep disconsolation because I'd missed the sunset. It's a 900-year-old boab tree in Western Australia. As I sat there glumly, the sun had a second setting. It struck the clouds far above my head and cast down a golden glow on Western Australia. I came to life and made this photograph. And I said to my guide, Mike Osborne, who was there, I said, Mike, I'm going to say something to you that I've never said in 30 years at the Geographic. He said, what's that? I said, I promise you this picture will be published. And when it was, he remembered that promise. And he took the magazine with a double-page picture of this photograph in it, back deep into the outback, a long all-day trip, because he wanted to surprise me with my photograph beneath the tree. And he did surprise me, but he surprised himself too. The tree had been struck by lightning and now was being consumed by green ants. 3 years later, I was to revisit this site with Mike. There was no tree. I'm occasionally asked what the most difficult assignment of my life has been, and the answer is easy. It happened after I left National Geographic and was working on a commission from John Grisham and his wife and their foundation, the Oakwood Foundation. They are conservation-minded, and they wanted a book about the beauty of the headwaters of the Amazon. Why was this the most difficult assignment? Because you couldn't get away from the Amazon. There were no horizon lines. It's a vertical world, and it's a dark one. There's life in the canopy and life beneath the water. I could photograph neither. In the jungle, it is an insect universe, and many of the insects are inimical to your health, biting, welting you, swelling your body, driving you crazy with itches. There's dust from the playas. There's constant humidity and heat. There's water from the sky and water from the rivers. There are reasons the Amazon is unphotographed generally. But the big reason is it's not Africa. There are no hippos, giraffes, elephants, lions, tigers, no rhinos, no hyenas, no herds. It's an insect world of trees, dense, dark, and difficult. This is the only time I was able to get away from the Amazon, and to console myself, I stood back with my camera on a tripod and just savored it, savored the distance that I had from the Amazon, the drop that I had on it, the beauty of it. And into the composition floated 9 egrets. And they floated slowly. I guess that I would say this is the greatest gift I ever got from photography or in photography, because it happened slowly, not quickly. There's another reason the Amazon was the most difficult. You couldn't see the animals. They've had millions of years to evolve camouflage. There's a chameleon in this photograph, and he or she cannot be seen, even though I've put the creature directly in the middle of the picture. There's a bird on this stony beach beside a river. You just can't see it. I'll give you a clue. It's not in the middle of the picture. Okay, I was lying about that. Now that you know where it is, I'll show you again where it was. There's a 12-foot long anaconda in this photograph. I know where it is, and I can't see it. But our 15-year-old boatman saw it and put out his arms and held us back and said, "Stop, something's wrong here." And he looked until he saw the eyeball of the snake. All I'll tell you about it is it's in the lower left-hand corner, the eye only. It's underneath those rotten tree limbs that have fallen from the canopy. It's made a nest for itself to strike out at anything on this game trail. But on this particular day, we were the game on the game trail. We very slowly began to uncover it, and then we took off one twig too many. I was in the middle of a 1-second exposure with my camera on the tripod, and I cursed the movement. I wasn't done making pictures. Now, if this had been digital, I would have bought drinks for everybody on our boat ride, because I think it's the best picture that I made in the Amazon. It's a picture that looks like the Amazon. A woman up here in the front is saying, "I remember that print." And the beautiful thing for you, unlike any other audience, is this show, brought to Eugene by Jill Hartz, had its inaugural display upstairs in this art museum. And upstairs, there's a picture of this scene. What is the scene? It's scene of insects swarming all over the regurgitated contents of a jaguar's stomach. The jaguar has eaten grass to settle its stomach and then regurgitated the grass, and along with it all of the gastric juices that are rare food for all of the insects. And one of those insects is the most beautiful butterfly in the world, the legendary and impossible to photograph blue morpho. Why impossible? It folds up its wings as soon as it lands. But it was up against the king of compose and wait. And I was going to outweight it. And I did. This print is upstairs in the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. The Amazon. Difficult to photograph, but not impossible. This was the cover picture for the book. And this, I thought, would be the cover picture, because this sloth, which is never seen outside of the canopy of a forest, is touching not only the river, but the title of the book, Headwaters of the Amazon. And this elegant butterfly is the most beautiful insect I've ever seen, but I almost didn't see it. I simply saw something move, something that shouldn't have been moving, a flicker, a fleeting, ephemeral motion. And I looked harder, and what it was a transparent winged butterfly. I followed it through the forest for 10 minutes as it flitted. Why 10 minutes? I was looking for the not only desirable, necessary, bright background. It had to be a bright background to reveal that the wings are transparent. But the floor of the rainforest is dark. There were very few bright spots. And so it took 10 minutes of crawling on my stomach and running after it and getting down until I found it on this leaf with a bright cluster of leaves behind. That is the Amazon to me. Immense, important, but realized photographically in moments of the tiniest and most fragile delicacy. I've spoken about microcomposition. Now I'm going to illustrate it. This is a little situation involving a friend and I, a woman from northern England who's visiting Washington, D.C. She's a photographer, so am I. She has her tea with cream, I black. It's winter. We're at the Corcoran Museum of Art. And the various textures and shapes of glass, of stone, of wood, of plastic, of synthetic material, of porcelain, and of liquid. All of these things combined to give this little scene the potential to have a life. But it doesn't have a life because of one detail. I'm going to change that and give it a life. I'm going to reach into the photograph, which I almost never do, and I'm going to draw the cup on the left, the one with the cream in it. I'm going to draw that handle toward me. It liberates the shadow of the plastic glass of water. Everything now has its own place and space in the photograph. Everything has a life, and in aggregate, the picture has a life, a small one, to be sure. We're not talking here about pears and the Kremlin. We're talking about tea at an art museum in Washington, D.C. But there is a difference, and the difference is microcomposition. How does this play out in the real world? I'm standing on a boat to give myself height so I have a drop on this photograph. I'm occasionally asked what I most want on assignment, and I say 3 feet to get me aesthetically above the subject. In other words, if I was going to photograph all of you in this room right now, I would not want to be standing here where your faces are compressed. I would want to be standing on this, and I would. And I'm doing that to get the drop on this blue racing gondola. But I'm also separating the dock pilings that it's anchored to from each other and from the island on the back layer of this photograph. Is it a great photograph? No. But I have this mantra: always take the best photograph that I can. And that's what I'm doing here in Davenport, Iowa, as I photograph the flooded city, the flood from the Mississippi River. I spoke about separation earlier. Now I'm standing on top of the car. The light is very critical. There's only seconds of this dramatic light. I know that this is going to be prominent in the foreground. It's on the front layer. So this is important, and this even more important. It's a tiny act of intense composition, but it separates the layers and allows the center of this photograph to be what your eye goes to, the disappearing dual tracks of the railroad disappearing under the floodwater. Do you notice this? Should you notice it? I would say no. You should feel the photograph, and it should feel inevitable. Here's a photograph I made at the University of Oregon. In Oregon, I was told last night. People didn't correct me until they'd had a couple of glasses of wine. I appreciated that, but I was not saying Oregon correctly. But here's this picture taken on the campus of the university. I had long wanted, for a series I'm undertaking called Modern American Realism, I had long wanted a picture that describes cubicle life. As someone said, this isn't a picture of an office, this is a picture of someone's mind. What's important to this about this picture photographically? I was being driven by a woman who worked at the art museum here to a lecture at a high school here in Eugene. And I asked her if she knew where we were, and she said, yes, I know where we are. I said, can you bring me back here? And she said, yes, I can bring you back here after the lecture. She had a Volvo, a very nice Volvo station wagon, but I made her drive it up onto the grass, and then I stood on top of it to come dead on to this composition, dead on to the center of the corner of the building, because I wanted the only movement in the photograph to be the gentle, subtle curling of 100 Post-it notes. You may think that microcomposition has no place in a photograph like this. That's what I thought. It's a mannequin dressed like a garden in fabric in Florence, Italy. I was not on assignment. I was with my wife. She was moving off down through the city. She resented the fact that I was not. I was lingering, I was loitering, I was looking, and I was stopped to take yet one more photograph. And I knew I didn't have much time, but I didn't need much time. This picture took itself. I needed to do nothing. Here's the picture I thought I needed. And then I noticed there was a reflection. It too had to be accounted for. And so I moved to my left. A tiny move, a major effect, and nothing was in motion. Microcomposition, what does it have to do with this picture? It's a compose and wait situation. I composed on the plaza, the wall, and the pavement. There was no figure in it. I waited. I waited for the woman to come around, or someone to come around the corner. What part of this picture is microcomposition? Her shadow. If it were touching the shadow of the bank building, as it's about to, I would not show you this picture. It would not be on the cover of the deluxe edition of my life's work. It's almost entirely black and white. There's only the faintest color. The woman's being double struck by light. It is, to me, a Zen view of the landscape I grew up on, the winter landscape of Northwest Ohio, with bulky, boxy buildings, brilliant light, and gray skies. She enters the picture. I photograph her. Can I take credit for her shadow not touching the shadow of the bank? I will just say this. The picture was made in 1977, and there were about 15 years when I was at the height of my photographic powers. That means my ability to see and render a photograph instantly. I no longer can do that. I can see the reflection on a window in Venice. And here is a critical example of the power and the necessity of microcomposition. This is the last living Shaker woman. She's a little bit senile. I've urged her, gently brought her out of her shabby, dark kitchen onto her back porch and asked her to look at the sun. I've placed her hands there, and then I've stepped back because I know this is only going to last seconds. She composes her hands comfortably, and she looks at the sun, and I step back, intensely aware that I need to separate the back of her hair from that building. Shaker buildings are a critical part of the Shaker story. The Shakers are gone. The buildings, their built world, their material universe is how we know them. The buildings in this picture are as important as she is. And so I'm zeroed in on the back of her hair, and I fail to notice in the first two photographs that I make that the edge of the roof beneath her chin is cutting into her throat. It is destroying dimensionality. Do you remember the stereo viewers that I talked about at the front of this lecture? That is what I want. This is the most 3D picture I ever made, but it depends entirely on the sharp edge of that Shaker building being separated in a tiny way from her throat. I made it on the third and final photograph. It's about this time in the slideshow when you think, Sam Abell, National Geographic, everything happens to him. He figures out all the problems. Things, if he waits, things happen. It was not that way, and it is not that way, and it especially was not that way on my first assignment, Newfoundland in winter. I couldn't figure out why no one wanted this assignment until I got there. This is me sleeping in my car. This is my car being pulled out of a ditch by fishermen using a school bus. And this is the room that one day I couldn't leave. I didn't leave the day after this or the day after the day before. I had photographer's block. I couldn't go out on that empty road and find nothing. Photography for me had always been dynamic, outgoing, extroverted, and engaging. But I didn't know how to either operate myself or operate as a photographer on assignment. There was nothing out there, and I couldn't face the nothingness. This is a photograph from my black and white diary, which I always wanted to exist for me as a testament of the truth. One picture changed that, the lead picture to the Newfoundland assignment. I'm only watching one thing here, and that is the father of the man in the foreground. He's in his own dory in the background, and I'm waiting for the North Atlantic to lift him above the horizon. I say to photographers, if you only learn the one thing from my workshop, learn this. For dignity, for stature, for standing in the photograph, put your people above the horizon line. That assignment got me a second assignment. All of my cameras, film, lenses were stolen the second week. I didn't call National Geographic. I couldn't admit it even though it wasn't my fault. I feared that they would send out a new photographer. I was that young and untried. They sent out new cameras, new film, and new lenses, and a new photographer. Now I was in competition not only with Yellowstone, but with Jonathan Blair, a veteran photographer. His massive picture of Yellowstone's Old Faithful dominates the exhibit upstairs. He had the brains, the smarts, and the know-how to build a huge scaffold to take that picture. I was trying to recover from a catastrophic theft. On my third assignment, I got undiagnosed and severe malaria. So did my guide, Chief Metak. We're in the Southwest Pacific on the Hebrides Islands, New Hebrides Islands. This is the first, but not the last, example of me photographing myself, my feelings, my condition, by photographing someone else. In 1975, while photographing hang gliders from a hang glider in Montana, I crashed mine and badly broke my back. I thought my career was over. And in 1993, while photographing for the Ireland story, the geographic story on Ireland, I was mugged and robbed by two skinheads who wanted my camera. I'll just say this in passing. I didn't notice this for years. Someone had to point it out to me. There's a grievous typo in the headline. Mugging shock for top photo man. It plays with our brains, doesn't it? The difficulties and hardships, disappointment and darkness of living this life I wanted, this photographic life, were not confined to my physical well-being. Sometimes they happened to my photographs. Remember this? It was on the cover of Harper's Magazine, one of my favorite magazines, but catastrophically printed backwards. I lived with this for about a week while I composed, or tried to compose, a letter to the editor. I wanted the editor to know how my backward picture looked on the cover of their magazine. Here's the letter to the editor that I sent. Here's a photograph of a cowboy doing a rope trick in New Mexico. It's my photograph. It's on the cover of the Guggenheim Museum Guide. I pause here to say that if it were a straight photograph of mine, it wouldn't be in a great museum like the Guggenheim. This is my photograph appropriated and changed a very small amount by the appropriation artist Richard Prince. I took the picture for Philip Morris. It was used in a Marlboro ad. And Prince stripped out the type and made the picture more garish, but it is my photograph. And the thing that makes me know that it's mine, I saw it from a distance at a book fair in New York, is the mesa at the top of the photograph above the double G in Guggenheim. That's me. I finish my photographs. And how do I finish them? I begin there. I begin with the back layer, the most distant, most deeply seen aspect of the picture. And here's my picture again, as the lead picture in an exhibit just like the one that's upstairs. It's the Museum of Modern Art's take on the greatest photographs of the West ever made. And the lead picture was Richard Prince's appropriated image of mine. If you would like to know my innermost feelings about this, I direct your attention to the YouTube where I'm interviewed discussing Richard Prince appropriating my photograph, changing it very little, and selling 2 copies each for $3.5 million. Just Google YouTube, Sam Abel, Richard Prince, and dollar signs. Do you remember my left hand that I almost lost in the Arctic? Here I am holding a map of Lewis and Clark's campgrounds where they crossed the Continental Divide from Montana into Idaho. Why this picture? Why my left hand? Because only moments before the engine on this plane conked out and went silent. And we began to dive for the ground. I don't know about you, but my sort of imagination about a plane with no engine, my thought about that is that it would glide to an empty interstate highway in Ohio. And that's not what happened. It was closer to a bowling ball falling. Somehow the pilot threw switches and turned his ignition on, and after about 10 very charged seconds, the plane sputtered back into life. I finished my photography, and we began to fly back to the airport. And on the way back, I made this picture to signify this moment, and to signify that I still had, after all these years, my left hand. It was planes that almost did me in. In a small plane with no door on it, I'm together with my guide, Mike Osborne, and a pilot. And I've told the pilot, stay on the outside of the Cyclone. The Cyclone was the subject of my photography. I needed a picture of it. We had to go in a small plane to find it. He was inexperienced, the storm was fast moving, and now we're underneath it. We barely survived that, and I don't think that we'll survive exiting this storm, and we can't go deeper into it. We have to fly to the light, and the pilot said there's no place to land. We'll be blown out into the Timor Sea, and no one will ever find us. I said, we've got to go out there. We cannot go into the darkness of the storm. So it was an argument, and I was scared. And to settle myself, I did what I always do. I photographed. I photographed to settle myself, but also because it was beautiful. It was a horizon line like I'd never seen before, and I knew that I would never see again, perhaps the last roll of film of my life. But obviously, we survived. I'm standing here today showing you this picture and telling this story, but I did swear that it would never happen again. No more small planes, no more cyclones, no more doors off, never. It happened 5 years later. There was no way around it. We were in a plane unequipped for night flying, no place to land, running short on fuel, and a pilot that was more afraid of the oncoming storm, which we had to fly into to get to Darwin. We had to go into it. For a long time, he flew alongside it. He turned off the intercom. He lit up the dashboard with a flashlight. It's a flashlight that one of my friends still has on his mantle. It's held together with gaffer tape. That was more substantial than our hopes or beliefs that we would survive this. I failed to make the photograph that I should have. We were surrounded by forked lightning. I didn't think that we would survive. I just was thinking about my life. And this flight met the definition and the details of every news story that you've ever read about why planes go down. A young pilot, unequipped for night flying, running low on fuel. All of the planes in the Darwin airport were grounded. They were grounded for hundreds of miles outside of Darwin. Only we were in the air. This photograph is illuminated by sheet lightning. The key word in this news story is lashed. This is Mike Osborne. In front of him is Carrie Trapnell, my two great friends, both photographers, who were my guides and assistants on the epic trips that I made in the 1990s throughout northern Australia. Great guys, and I felt bad because their lives were ahead of them. I had lived a great life. Mike is looking at the storm, the oncoming storm. This is the last sunlight we would see. I felt bad because I owed them a lot. Mike had shown me the 900-year-old Boab, Carrie just as good at things on the other side of Australia. But on the other hand, Mike owed me. I'd introduced him to his wife, a British girl, a graduate of Cambridge University who was hitchhiking around the world with a Danish friend of hers, a girl from Copenhagen. I came across them in the great sandy desert, sunburned and holding a sign. A very deserted part of Australia, and the sign said Roadhouse. And I knew that the Roadhouse was 60 miles away and there was nothing between where they were standing and the Roadhouse. And I said, girls, hop in. And then Mike pulled up alongside us in his Land Cruiser, and I shot a smirking grin at him and said, boys, meet Anne and Renata. Anne, Renata, meet Mike and Harvey. By the time we got to the Roadhouse, Mike had fixed the car, a broken down car of two Australian women, and tried to repair the wing, the broken wing of a parakeet. And Anne had fallen in love with him. Not many couples who get married have a photograph of the day, the hour, practically the moment that they met. But this picture was taken at the Roadhouse. They were married. They had 2 beautiful daughters. I came back to see the now gone Boab tree. Mike said, Sam, Ann and I owe you everything. If we ever have a boy, we're going to name him after you. I got the call about a year and a half later. Mike, who'd had a few beers, middle of the night, shouting into the phone, said, Sam, Ann's just had a baby boy. She's doing fine. The girls are good. Just wanted to let you know, mate. Silence. I said, Mike, would you name the baby boy? Daryl. Even when bad things happen, there could be a goodness to them. Bono saw this slideshow, sought me out, and invited me to his concert. Sang a song just so he would be near to me, stood up, pointed down, and he said, that was for you. I carefully composed this picture in Japan from the inn window. It became the cover of my favorite book that I've ever done, written, designed, and photographed by me, called Seeing Gardens. If I stick my camera out the window, I take a photograph of a garden. If I bring the camera back inside, it's Seeing Gardens. It's about the act of seeing. One of the sentences in the book, the key sentence is, often we are far from the garden of our dreams, but nearby may be a reminder of it, waiting to be seen. And I was often far from the garden of my dreams. I was on a cold bus in a cold city, Moscow, in the winter. I was in Kashmir when a wedding party showed up. I was in Japan where the emperor was going to plant a tree in this tree planting site. I was in England and photographed this tray of sedums in a warm place on a garden roof. And I was in Colorado Springs at my in-laws' house and photographed this scene after a hailstorm brought down the leaves of a maple tree. All seeing gardens. Gardens where there are no gardens, but nearby may be a reminder of a garden waiting to be seen. All these good things are small compared to the best thing that happened to me, which is walking through California. I said hiking through California, Oregon, and Washington in 1973 and 74 on the Pacific Crest Trail. This photograph represents an entire day of my life. We started in those trees left of center. It took us all day to get this far on the slopes of Mount Whitney. We walked 1,600 miles with 40-pound packs on that summer. My admiration, though, was for the through hikers, those hikers who start at the Mexico border and walk 2,700 miles through the mountains of California, Oregon, and Washington, and end their summer 7 months later at the US-Canada border. Here are 4 of them. The woman on the right lasted 50 miles. The boy next to her in the brown shirt lasted the length of California. The woman in blue, my wife-to-be, walked the length of the trail because she had made a solemn promise to her boyfriend that she was inconveniently hiking with, that she would walk the trail. After 500 miles, the Pacific Crest Trail is not a test of strength, it's a test of character. And her character was tested because that summer she and I fell in love. We were married in 1977 and have traveled together ever since. This is Denise Myers of Colorado Springs, Colorado. near the Canadian border 7 months later. The other good thing I did in my career was work with the best writers I could. This is Stephen Ambrose. And this is Stephen Ambrose. First on the Lewis and Clark book, then on the Mississippi River book. He said, Sam, I've got the easiest thing to do on these 2 books. All I have to do is retell the stories of the greatest canoeing, camping, hunting, and fishing trip of all time, the Lewis and Clark trip and the Louisiana Purchase. You, Sam, have the hardest job. You have to tell the story of the American West as though nothing had happened. There's the American West that Lewis and Clark faced. That's the American West of the Louisiana Purchase. Those were our subjects. What did Ambrose mean by that? That I had a hard job. That I had to pretend that nothing had happened in the West. A lot had happened. Here's Lewis and Clark's most consequential campground, when they got horses from Sacagawea's people and made it over the Continental Divide. Without her, without those horses, they wouldn't have made it. That campsite's underwater. All of them are. So I couldn't photograph that. I had to photograph this. Moonrise in Montana over Square Butte. The picture is upstairs in this exhibition. But this one isn't. An Indian medicine man, also in the West, as his train pulls into Albuquerque. So this was off the table. This I could photograph, the Sundance of the Blood Indians in Alberta. So the Sundance at sunset, but not sunrise in Las Vegas. Cowboys like this, but not this. Indians like this, but not this. Moonrise along the Yellowstone River, with the shadow of the tree being cast by the moon onto hot thermal steam. So this moonrise, yes. At this sunrise in San Francisco, no. So what did I do? I consulted the work of Charlie Russell. I used atmospherics and certain camera angles to suggest that the West was unchanged. I had to evoke the West that Lewis and Clark saw. In Idaho and on the Pacific coast of Oregon. The West, the most mythic landscape on earth, combining landscape values and culture. Cowboys, Indians, the big sky, the great landscape. How did I photograph it? Like I photographed everything. I composed the picture and waited. Waited for the cowboy to look up, for the horse to shake its mane, and that noise alert the dog. Not a problem to make this picture if it's all composed and you're simply waiting. The West, site of some of my greatest moments in photography, many of my happiest moments, my courtship, the beautiful light and great reach and distant horizon lines of the West. That picture of Johnny Sailor throwing a horseshoe in eastern Montana became for 1 month the largest photograph on Earth. And this photograph became my most well-known image, the image my colleagues respect the most. It's the open prairie of Montana, and I take a position right here and don't move. I close the picture on the distant horizon line, and I concentrate on this cowboy. Whatever else is happening at that branding, I disregard. With my eye on the distant horizon and concentration on that one cowboy, I make the most complex and dimensional photograph of my career. I've made one. This is it, and it's upstairs in the museum. The picture has a life, and I've given it. National Geographic did not publish this initially. Only after it became well known through books of my own did they publish it. And now they call it one of the 50 greatest pictures ever made at the Geographic. As for me, I am putting it on the collected 4-volume edition of my work. 1/4 of the photograph will appear on the spine of each of the 4 boxes. The West, those big states, the cowboy, the pottery, the cactus, Yellowstone Falls, the fruit, the abundance, the bigness, the greatness. I've had it in me since I was a boy in Ohio. Do you need proof of that? Here it is. I took the spirit of my mother, her aesthetics, into my photography. And I took my dad with me, and he took me. He took me into photography, and our journey never ended. This photograph shows a train, and that train is headed for New York City. And he and I were both to get there at the high point of my career. A one-man show at the International Center of Photography. My dad was the guest of honor. Stay this moment refers to the brilliant phrase by Virginia Woolf. If one does not lie back and sum up and say to the moment, this very moment, stay, you are so fair, what will be one's gain? Dying? No. Stay this moment. No one ever says that enough. But when I read that famous phrase from her diary, I thought photographers say it every time that they make a heartfelt photograph. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you, and I want to say you have a great museum here, and I can tell that you almost don't need to hear that. You're very loyal to the museum, and I'm proud to be a part of your family. Thank you.